The morning sun was already beating down hard when David pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank. He sat in his old Honda Civic for a moment, the car that had become his home for the past 8 months. The back seat was folded down, covered with a sleeping bag and a thin pillow. A small duffel bag held everything he owned in this world. David looked at himself in the rearview mirror and sighed. His hair needed cutting. His beard was getting too long. The shirt he wore was clean but wrinkled from being stored in his bag. He'd washed it 2 days ago at the public restroom in the park, but without an iron, it still looked rough. His jeans had a small tear at the knee and his sneakers were worn thin at the soles, but today was important. Today he had to go inside that bank. In his hand, he held a check for $847. It was his first disability payment from the VA in months. The paperwork had taken forever to process. There had been forms, then more forms, then appointments he'd almost missed because he didn't always know what day it was anymore. When you're homeless, time becomes a strange thing. Days blend together into a long stretch of just trying to survive. David had served his country for 12 years, 2 tours overseas. He'd been a good soldier, the kind his commanding officers could count on. But when he came back, things were different. The nightmares started. The sounds of everyday life made him jumpy. A car backfiring would send him diving for cover. Crowds made him anxious. He couldn't hold down a job because some days he just couldn't function. His wife left first, taking their daughter with her. He didn't blame her. He wasn't the same man she'd married. Then the bills piled up. The house went into foreclosure. Before he knew it, David was living in his car, parking behind a grocery store at night where the manager didn't chase him away. He'd banked at First National for 15 years. Back when he had a house, a family, a normal life. Back when bank tellers knew his name and asked about his daughter. But that was before. Now he was just another homeless guy, and he knew people looked at him differently. Taking a deep breath, David opened his car door and stepped out into the heat. The walk from the parking lot to the bank entrance felt longer than it should have. He could feel people watching him. A woman loading groceries into her car grabbed her purse a little tighter when he walked past. An older man gave him a look that said, "Keep moving." The automatic doors of the bank slid open with a soft whoosh, and cold air conditioning hit David's face. It felt good after sitting in the hot car. The bank lobby was nice, with marble floors and comfortable chairs. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Everything was clean and orderly and felt like a different world from the one David lived in. He noticed right away how the atmosphere changed when he walked in. Conversations got quieter. People glanced at him, then quickly looked away. A mother pulled her young son a little closer. The security guard by the door straightened up, his hand moving to rest on his belt, eyes locked on David. David had seen that look before. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." It was the look he'd gotten at restaurants, at stores, at the library when he tried to use the bathroom to wash up. Being homeless made you invisible and hypervisible at the same time. Most people tried to pretend you didn't exist, but they also watched you like you might steal something. He walked slowly across the marble floor, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly. There were 4 teller windows, but only 2 were open. A young woman was helping a customer at the first window. At the second window, another teller was counting money. David got in line behind an elderly gentleman in a nice suit. The old man turned around, looked David up and down, then actually took a step forward, putting more distance between them. David felt his face burn with shame, but he kept his eyes down and waited. When it was finally his turn, the elderly man finished his business and walked away quickly, giving David a wide berth. David approached the teller window, trying to stand up straight, trying to look respectable despite his appearance. The teller was a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and bright red lipstick. When she looked up and saw David, her friendly smile disappeared. Her nose wrinkled slightly, and she leaned back in her chair, putting distance between them. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold and formal. David's hands were shaking as he slid the check and his military ID under the glass partition. "Yes, ma'am. I need to cash this check, please." The teller picked up the check with 2 fingers, like she was afraid to touch it. She looked at it, then at him, then at the check again. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together in a frown. "This is a government check," she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am. It's from the VA, Veterans Affairs. It's my disability payment." She stared at the check for a long moment, then looked at his ID. David could see the doubt in her eyes. She was probably thinking the ID was fake, or the check was stolen, or something was wrong, because how could this homeless man be a veteran with a legitimate check? "Hold on," she said, standing up. "I need to get my supervisor." David's heart sank. He knew what was coming. He'd been through this before at other places. The doubt, the suspicion, the assumption that because he looked poor and homeless, he must be doing something wrong. The teller walked over to a man in a dark suit who was standing near the office area. He was in his 40s, with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch. She whispered something to him, glancing back at David. The supervisor's face hardened, and he walked over to the teller window with quick, purposeful steps. "Sir," the supervisor said loudly, his voice carrying across the lobby. Other customers turned to look. "I'm going to need you to leave the bank." David felt every eye in the place turn toward him. Heat rushed to his face. "Sir, I just need to cash my check. It's legitimate. I can show you my military ID, We can't cash this check," the supervisor interrupted, his voice even louder now. "It looks suspicious. And quite frankly, sir, you don't look like you have the means to have an account here or to be cashing checks of this amount." "But I've banked here for 15 years, David said, his voice shaking. "I had an account here. I lost everything, but this is a real check. It's from the Veterans Affairs. I served my country for 12 years. Please, I just need—" "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," the supervisor said, cutting him off. He snapped his fingers at the security guard. "Robert, please escort this man out of the building." David felt his world crumbling. That check was everything. It was food for the next month. It was gas for his car. It was hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to put his life back together. Without it, he had nothing. The security guard, a younger guy who looked uncomfortable, walked over slowly. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Please," David said, hating how desperate he sounded. "Please just look at the check. Call the VA if you need to verify it. This is everything I have." But the supervisor had already turned away, dismissing him. The security guard put a hand on David's arm, not rough, but firm. "Come on, sir. Let's go." David felt tears burning in his eyes as he was led toward the door. Around him, customers whispered to each other. Some looked sympathetic, but no one said anything. No one stood up for him. He was just another problem being removed, another uncomfortable situation being handled. As they reached the door, David's military training kicked in. He stood straighter, pulled his arm free from the guard's gentle grip, and walked out on his own. He wouldn't be dragged out. He'd leave with whatever dignity he had left. But as the cool air conditioning gave way to the blazing heat outside, David felt something break inside him. He'd served his country. He'd fought for the freedom of every person in that bank. And now they were treating him like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. Like his service, his sacrifice, his suffering meant nothing because he was poor and homeless and didn't look the way they thought he should. He stood on the sidewalk outside the bank, the check still clutched in his hand, and wondered what he was going to do now. How was he supposed to survive? Where could he go? What David didn't know was that someone inside the bank had seen everything, someone who understood exactly what he'd been through, someone who wasn't going to let this injustice stand. And in the next few minutes, everything was about to change. Mr. Daniels returned from the teller window with David's money, counting out $847 in cash. His hands were still shaking as he slid the bills under the glass partition. David took the money carefully, folding it, and putting it in his pocket like it was the most precious thing in the world, because right now, it was. "Thank you," David said quietly. The colonel watched the transaction complete, then turned to Mr. Daniels with a look that said this conversation wasn't over. "Now, Mr. Daniels, I think we need to have a longer discussion about what just happened here." The supervisor nodded nervously. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Whatever you need. First, I want to speak with your CEO. What's his name?" Mr. Daniels went even paler. "That's..." That's Mr. Robert Harrison, ma'am, but he's very busy, and I'm not sure— Oh, I'm sure he'll make time for this conversation, the colonel said, pulling out her phone. What's the main corporate number? Ma'am, please, Mr. Daniels said, his voice desperate now. I've already apologized. I cashed the check. Can't we just— Just what? Forget this happened? The colonel's voice was sharp. Son, do you think this is the first time something like this has happened? Do you think you're the only bank employee who's ever judged someone based on how they look? This isn't just about you making one mistake. This is about a culture that allows people to treat veterans, to treat homeless people, like they're somehow less human than everyone else. She looked around the lobby at the other customers who were still watching. How many of you have walked past a homeless person and assumed they were lazy or addicts, or that they somehow deserved their situation? A few people looked uncomfortable. Some looked down at their feet. Most homeless people are just regular folks who had everything go wrong at once, the colonel continued. A medical emergency, a job loss, a divorce, mental health issues from trauma. And veterans, we send them to war. We ask them to do impossible things. We expose them to horrors that most of us can't even imagine, and then we act surprised when they come back changed. When they struggle, when they can't just slot back into normal life like nothing happened. She turned back to Mr. Daniels. So no, we're not just going to forget this happened. Give me that number. Mr. Daniels, realizing he had no choice, recited the corporate office number. The colonel dialed, putting the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. After a few rings, a pleasant female voice answered. First National Bank corporate office. How may I direct your call? I need to speak with Mr. Harrison immediately, the colonel said. Tell him it's Colonel Helen Bradford calling about a serious incident at one of his branches. I'm sorry, ma'am, but Mr. Harrison is in a meeting right now. I can take a message and— Interrupt the meeting, the colonel said firmly. Tell him I'm standing in his 5th and Main Street branch, where I just watched a homeless veteran get discriminated against and nearly thrown out for trying to cash a legitimate VA check. Tell him I have my phone out and I'm deciding right now whether to call the media or give him a chance to handle this internally. You have 2 minutes to get him on this phone. There was a pause. Then the receptionist said nervously, Please hold, ma'am. The lobby was silent except for the soft hold music coming from the phone. David stood there, still not quite believing what was happening. Mr. Daniels looked like he might be sick. The other customers were frozen, watching this drama unfold like it was a movie. Less than a minute later, the hold music cut off and a man's voice came on the line. This is Robert Harrison. Who am I speaking with? Mr. Harrison, my name is Colonel Helen Bradford, United States Army, retired. I'm currently standing in your branch at 5th and Main Street, and I need to tell you about something that just happened here. I'm listening, Mr. Harrison said, his voice cautious. The colonel proceeded to describe everything she'd witnessed. She didn't exaggerate or add drama. She didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. She described how David had entered the bank with a legitimate check, how he'd been judged immediately based on his appearance, how the supervisor had refused to even verify his check properly, how he'd been loudly humiliated in front of other customers, how he'd been told he didn't belong there and was being escorted out. As she spoke, Mr. Harrison's responses went from cautious to concerned to angry, but his anger wasn't directed at the colonel. It was directed at what had happened in his bank. Let me speak with the branch manager, Mr. Harrison said, his voice tight. The colonel handed her phone to Mr. Daniels, who took it like it was a live grenade. This is Richard Daniels, sir. What happened next was uncomfortable to watch. Mr. Harrison's voice, still on speaker for everyone to hear, was professional but ice-cold. He asked Mr. Daniels to explain his actions. Mr. Daniels stammered through an explanation about policy and suspicious circumstances and being cautious about fraud. Did you verify the check? Mr. Harrison asked. No, sir, but did you look at his military ID properly? Well, I glanced at it, but Did you treat this customer with the respect that every customer deserves, regardless of their appearance or economic status? There was a long pause. No, sir, I didn't. Mr. Daniels, I'm going to be very clear with you, Mr. Harrison said. What you did today was not only against our company policies, it was discriminatory, it was cruel, and it was completely unacceptable. You will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. You'll receive a call from HR within the hour. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Mr. Daniels said miserably. Now put Colonel Bradford back on the phone. The colonel took her phone back. I'm here, Mr. Harrison. Colonel, I cannot apologize enough for what happened in my bank today, Mr. Harrison said, and he sounded genuinely upset. This is not what we stand for. This is not how we train our employees, and I promise you, this will not go unaddressed. I appreciate that, Mr. Harrison, the colonel said, but I think there's someone else who deserves to hear your apology more than me. She handed the phone to David, who took it hesitantly. Hello? Sir, is this the veteran who was mistreated today? Mr. Harrison asked. Yes, sir. My name is David. David, I am so deeply sorry for what happened to you in my bank today. You served our country, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Instead, you were judged and humiliated. That's on me. That's on my company. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make this right. David didn't know what to say. His voice came out rough and emotional. Thank you, sir. I just needed to cash my check. I understand. And going forward, you'll never have this problem again. I'm setting up a new account for you personally. No fees, ever. And I'm assigning you a personal banker who will make sure you always receive the service you deserve. Additionally, I'd like to offer you $1,000 as an apology for the distress this caused you. David's eyes went wide. Sir, that's not necessary. It absolutely is necessary, Mr. Harrison said firmly. You were wronged. We need to make it right. The money will be in your new account by the end of the day. After a few more exchanges, the call ended. David handed the phone back to the colonel, his hands shaking even more than before. The colonel looked at him with a small smile. You okay, son? I don't know what just happened, David said honestly. I came here thinking I was going to cash a check. Now I have money, an account, and... He trailed off, overwhelmed. Now you have someone in your corner, the colonel said. And I'm not done yet. Come on, let's get out of this bank and get some lunch. We have a lot to talk about. As they walked toward the door, several customers approached David. One older woman pressed a $20 bill into his hand. Thank you for your service, she said with tears in her eyes. A younger man shook his hand. A teenager asked if he could take a picture with him. David was overwhelmed by the sudden attention, the sudden kindness. Half an hour ago, these same people had been stepping away from him, judging him, treating him like he was invisible or dangerous. Now they saw him differently, not because he had changed, but because someone had stood up and reminded them that he was human, that he mattered. As they stepped out into the sunshine, David turned to the colonel. Why did you do all that for me? You don't even know me. The colonel stopped and looked at him seriously. Son, I spent 35 years in the military. I know exactly what you've been through. Maybe not your specific story, but I know the sacrifice. I know the cost. And I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by and watch while someone who served their country gets treated like garbage. She started walking again, and David followed. Besides, she added, my son was military too. He didn't make it home. So when I see a veteran who needs help, I think about him. And I do what I hope someone would have done for him if he'd needed it. David felt tears on his face again, but they were different tears now. Not tears of shame or desperation, tears of gratitude, of hope, of feeling, for the first time in a long time, like maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. Inside the bank, near the back of the lobby, stood a woman who had seen the entire scene unfold. Her name was Colonel Helen Bradford, retired military, though most people just called her the Colonel. At 70 years old, she still carried herself like the officer she'd been for 35 years. Her silver hair was cut short and neat. She wore a simple pantsuit, practical shoes, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of making important decisions. The Colonel had been waiting to speak with someone about her business account when the commotion started. She'd watched the homeless veteran walk into the bank. She'd seen how people moved away from him, how they judged him with their eyes before knowing anything about him. And she'd recognized something in the way he carried himself. Even in his worn clothes and desperate situation, she knew that posture, that way of standing straight even when the world is pushing you down. She'd seen it in thousands of soldiers over her career. Once a soldier, always a soldier. The military becomes part of who you are, how you move, how you face the world. When the supervisor started raising his voice, the Colonel felt her jaw tighten. When he refused to even look at the veteran's check properly, she felt anger building in her chest. And when the security guard was called to escort this man out, she'd had enough. The Colonel moved forward quickly, her voice cutting through the lobby like a command that expected to be followed. "Stop right there." Everyone froze. The security guard stopped walking. The supervisor turned around, looking annoyed at the interruption. David stood there, confused, not understanding what was happening. The entire bank lobby went quiet. The Colonel walked straight up to David, ignoring everyone else. She looked him in the eye, and then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She came to attention and gave him a small nod of respect, one service member to another. "Son," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Were you in the military?" David straightened up automatically, the way soldiers do when addressed by a superior officer. Even after years away from service, that instinct never leaves. "Yes, ma'am. I served 12 years. 2 deployments overseas." The Colonel nodded slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. She saw past the worn clothes and the desperate situation. She saw the man underneath, the soldier who had served his country. "What branch?" "Army, ma'am. And that check in your hand, that's from the VA?" "Yes, ma'am. It's my disability payment. First one I've gotten in months. The paperwork took forever to process, and I really need to cash it because—" The Colonel held up her hand, and David stopped talking. She turned to face the supervisor, and when she spoke, her voice could have frozen fire. "Young man, what's your name?" The supervisor looked uncomfortable now. The confidence he'd had when dealing with David was gone. Something about this woman made him nervous. "I'm Richard Daniels, ma'am. I'm the branch manager here." "Mr. Daniels?" the Colonel said, her voice dangerously calm. "Did I just watch you refuse to cash a legitimate government check for a military veteran?" "Ma'am, I was just following protocol. The check looked suspicious, and the customer didn't seem—" "Didn't seem what?" the Colonel interrupted. "Didn't seem clean enough for you? Didn't seem wealthy enough? Didn't look the way you think a veteran should look?" The lobby was dead silent now. Every customer, every employee, everyone was watching this confrontation unfold. Some people had their phones out, probably recording. Mr. Daniels' face was turning red. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we have policies about cashing large checks for people who don't have accounts here, and when someone comes in looking like, well, we have to be careful about fraud." "He has an ID," the Colonel said, her voice sharp. "Did you verify it?" "Well, no, but did you call the VA to verify the check?" "No, but did you do anything except judge this man based on his appearance?" Mr. Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. The Colonel turned to David. "Son, may I see that check and your ID?" David handed them over with shaking hands. The Colonel examined them carefully, taking her time. She looked at the check, checked the official markings, the signature, the routing numbers. She looked at the military ID, then at David's face, then back at the ID. "This is a legitimate VA disability check," she announced loudly, making sure everyone in the bank could hear her. "This man's ID is valid. Everything here is in order. There is absolutely no reason to refuse this transaction except pure discrimination." She handed the check and ID back to David, then turned back to Mr. Daniels. "I served this country for 35 years. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I commanded 3 different bases and over 4,000 soldiers. And I'm telling you right now, what you just did is not only wrong, it's disgusting." Mr. Daniels looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job. Your job is to serve customers. This man is a customer. He banked here for 15 years. He served his country while you were probably still in school. And the minute things got hard for him, the minute he needed help, you threw him out like garbage." The colonel's voice got louder. She wasn't yelling, but her words carried weight. "Do you know what this man probably went through? Do you know what it costs to serve overseas? The things he saw? The friends he lost? The pieces of himself he left behind in some desert fighting for your freedom?" Mr. Daniels tried to speak, but the colonel wasn't finished. "And he comes home to what? To people like you judging him? Treating him like a criminal because he fell on hard times? Because he's homeless?" She said that last word clearly, not ashamed, not whispered. "Yes, he's homeless. I can see that. Anyone with eyes can see that. But that doesn't make him less of a person. That doesn't erase his service. That doesn't give you the right to treat him with disrespect." By now, several other customers were nodding. An older man said, "That's right," loud enough for everyone to hear. A woman was wiping tears from her eyes. The colonel pulled out her phone. "Now I'm going to give you 2 choices, Mr. Daniels. Choice 1. You cash this man's check right now, you apologize to him sincerely, and we forget this ever happened. Choice 2. I call your bank's CEO, who happens to be a personal friend of mine, and I explain to him exactly what I witnessed here today. I also call the local news station because I'm sure they'd love to hear about how First National Bank treats homeless veterans. And then I post about this on social media, where I have about 20,000 followers, many of them veterans who would be very interested in this story." She paused, letting her words sink in. "So what's it going to be?" Mr. Daniels looked panicked now. His face had gone from red to pale. "Ma'am, please, there's no need for all that. I'm sure we can work this out. I apologize. I made a mistake." "You don't apologize to me," the colonel said coldly. "I'm not the one you disrespected. You apologized to him." She pointed at David. Mr. Daniels turned to David, and for the first time, he actually looked at him like a human being. "Sir, I sincerely apologize. I made a terrible error in judgment. Please let me personally cash your check, and I'd like to waive any fees associated with the transaction." David stood there, overwhelmed. He didn't know what to say. 5 minutes ago, he was being thrown out of the bank. Now this stranger, this colonel, was fighting for him like he mattered, like his dignity was worth protecting. "It's okay," David finally managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "No," the colonel said firmly. "It's not okay, but we're going to make it right." She looked at Mr. Daniels. "Cash his check, now!" The supervisor nodded quickly and practically ran to the teller window. He pushed the young teller aside and began processing David's check himself, his hands fumbling with the keys. The colonel turned to David and spoke more softly now. "Son, don't you ever let anyone treat you like you're less than you are. You served your country. You're a veteran. You deserve respect, whether you're living in a mansion or living in your car." David felt tears running down his face now, and he didn't care who saw. "Thank you, ma'am. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," she said, "but you do need to let me buy you lunch after this. Because I think we need to talk about getting you some help. Real help." And that's when David realized that maybe, just maybe, his luck was finally starting to change. 3 months had passed since that day at the bank. 3 months that had changed David's life in ways he never could have imagined. It started with that lunch. The colonel had taken him to a small diner down the street from the bank. David remembered feeling self-conscious walking in, worried about what people would think. But the colonel walked in like she owned the place, found them a booth, and ordered enough food for both of them without even asking what he wanted. "Eat," she'd said simply when the food arrived. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in weeks." She was right. David couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something that wasn't from a gas station or a fast food dollar menu. He'd eaten slowly, trying not to look too desperate, but the colonel just smiled and ordered him seconds. While they ate, she'd asked him questions. Not intrusive questions, not judgmental questions. Just simple things. What had he done in the military? What kind of work had he done before? What were his skills? What did he need? David had been honest with her. He told her about his struggles with PTSD, about the nightmares that still woke him up at night, about how he'd lost his family, his home, everything, about how he'd been trying to get his disability claim processed for over a year, about how he'd been living in his car, barely surviving day to day. The colonel had listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she'd nodded thoughtfully and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make some calls," she'd said. "I know people who help veterans. Good people. Real programs that actually work, not just bureaucracy and paperwork." And she had. Right there in that diner, the colonel had spent an hour on the phone. She called a veterans housing program she knew about. She called a counselor who specialized in PTSD. She called someone at the VA and, using that commanding voice of hers, had gotten David's case escalated and reviewed. She'd even called a friend who ran a construction company that specifically hired veterans. By the time they left the diner, David had 3 appointments scheduled for the following week. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into a different reality where things actually worked out. That first week had been overwhelming. The colonel had driven him to every appointment, waited with him, advocated for him when needed. The housing program had found him a spot in a transitional living facility. It wasn't fancy, just a small room with a bed and a bathroom, but it was his. 4 walls and a roof. A place to sleep where he didn't have to worry about being told to move along. The counseling sessions were hard. Talking about the things he'd been through, the things he'd seen overseas, the guilt he carried. But his counselor, a veteran herself, understood in a way that others hadn't. She didn't judge him. She didn't try to fix him overnight. She just helped him start processing everything he'd been carrying alone for so long. The construction job came through in the 2nd week. The owner, a grizzled former Marine named Phil, had looked at David's work history, nodded once, and said, "When can you start?" No long interview process. No judgment about the gap in his employment. Just a chance. David had almost cried when Phil handed him a work uniform and a pair of steel-toed boots. "Can't have you on the site without proper gear," Phil had said gruffly. "Consider it an advance on your first paycheck." The work was hard. Physical labor that left David exhausted at the end of each day. But it was good exhaustion. The kind that came from doing something productive, from earning an honest wage, from being part of a team again. His co-workers were a mix of veterans and civilians, and they treated him like one of them. No pity, no special treatment. Just respect and camaraderie. Now 3 months later, David stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment. Not the room at the transitional facility anymore. An actual apartment. Small, just a studio, but it was his. He'd signed the lease 2 weeks ago with money he'd saved from his paychecks and his disability payments, which were now coming regularly. He'd gotten a haircut. He'd bought new clothes. Nothing fancy, just clean jeans and shirts that fit properly. He'd shaved his beard down to something neat and trimmed. Looking at his reflection, he barely recognized himself. He looked like a regular person again. Like someone with a life, a purpose, a future. Today was important. The colonel had called him yesterday and asked him to meet her at the bank. The same bank where everything had started. David had been nervous about going back, worried about facing those memories, but the colonel had insisted. "Trust me," she'd said. "You need to be there." So here he was, walking through those same automatic doors he'd walked through 3 months ago. But everything felt different now. He wasn't walking in defeated and desperate. He was walking in with his head up, with dignity, with hope. The lobby looked the same, but somehow it felt different. Maybe because he felt different. The security guard, Robert, was still there. When he saw David, his eyes widened in recognition, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled and nodded respectfully. "Good to see you again, sir," Robert said. David nodded back, surprised and touched by the gesture. The colonel was already there, standing near the office area. But she wasn't alone. There were 3 other people with her, 2 men and 1 woman. They all had that same look, that bearing that marked them as veterans. The colonel waved David over. "David, I want you to meet some people," she said. "This is James, this is Lisa, and this is Carlos. They're all veterans, and they're all going through situations similar to what you went through." David shook hands with each of them, seeing in their eyes the same struggles he'd faced. James looked like he'd been living rough. Lisa had that hollow look of someone barely holding on. Carlos seemed nervous, uncomfortable in his own skin. "I don't understand," David said to the colonel. "Why are we all here?" The colonel smiled, and there was something proud in her expression. "Because I've been thinking a lot about what happened here 3 months ago. About how one person standing up made a difference for you. And I realized that there are thousands of veterans out there who need someone to stand up for them, who need real help, not just paperwork and programs that don't work." She gestured around the lobby. "Mr. Harrison, the bank CEO, has agreed to let us use this bank as a meeting place. And more than that, he's agreed to help fund something I've been working on. David, I want you to help me start a foundation. A real organization that helps homeless veterans get back on their feet." David felt his heart start beating faster. "Ma'am, I don't know anything about running a foundation. But you know what it's like to be homeless. You know what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. You know what works and what doesn't because you've lived it." The colonel's voice was passionate now. "These 3 people here, they need what you needed 3 months ago. Someone who understands. Someone who won't give up on them. Someone who's been where they are and made it out." David looked at James, Lisa, and Carlos. He saw himself in their faces. He remembered what it felt like to be that desperate, that lost, that forgotten. "What would I do?" he asked quietly. "You'd be our peer counselor," the colonel explained. "You'd meet with veterans who are struggling. You'd help them navigate the system. You'd be living proof that things can get better. You'd give them something I couldn't give you that day in the bank. Hope." Before David could respond, Mr. Harrison himself walked over. David recognized his voice from the phone call. The CEO extended his hand. "David, I'm Robert Harrison. I owe you an apology in person for what happened here. What you went through in my bank was unacceptable, but I'd like to make amends in a bigger way. I want this bank to be part of the solution. We're committing $50,000 to start this foundation, and we'll host monthly meetings here for veterans who need services." David shook his hand, overwhelmed. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help," the colonel said. "Say you'll take everything you learned from your experience and use it to help others. Say you'll be part of this." David looked around at all the faces watching him. The colonel, who'd saved him when he had nothing. Mr. Harrison, who was trying to make things right. Robert, the security guard, who'd watched everything unfold. The other customers in the bank who'd stopped what they were doing to listen. And James, Lisa, and Carlos, who needed someone to believe in them the way the colonel had believed in him. He thought about that day 3 months ago when he'd stood outside this bank, completely broken, thinking his life was over. He thought about everything that had happened since. The kindness he'd received, the chances he'd been given, the dignity that had been restored to him. "Yes," David said, his voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll help. I'll do whatever I can." The colonel's face broke into a huge smile. She put her hand on his shoulder. "That's my soldier." 6 months after the foundation launched, David sat in a small office inside the bank's community room. The space had been transformed from a rarely used conference area into a welcoming hub for veterans. Comfortable chairs lined the walls. A coffee machine always had fresh coffee brewing. Pamphlets about various services covered a bulletin board. Most importantly, there was always someone there to listen, to help, to care. David looked at the schedule on his desk. He had 3 appointments today. The first one with James, the veteran he'd met on that first day at the bank, was in 10 minutes. James had come a long way in the past 6 months, but he still struggled sometimes. They all did. Recovery wasn't a straight line. It was messy, complicated, full of setbacks and small victories. The door opened and James walked in. He looked better than he had 6 months ago. He'd put on some healthy weight. His clothes were clean. He'd been staying at the transitional housing facility and working part-time at a warehouse. But David could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. "Hey, James," David said, gesturing to a chair. "Have a seat. Coffee?" "Yeah, thanks," James said, settling into the chair with a heavy sigh. David poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. He didn't start with questions. He'd learned that sometimes people just needed a minute to gather themselves. He waited, sipping his coffee, letting James take his time. "I almost didn't come today," James finally said. Almost convinced myself I didn't need to. That I was fine. But you came anyway, David pointed out. That takes courage. James looked down at his coffee cup. I got my first paycheck yesterday. Real money, you know. Money I earned. And instead of feeling good about it, I panicked. Started thinking about all the ways I could mess this up. All the ways I've messed things up before? David nodded. He understood that feeling completely. When I got my first paycheck from the construction job, I didn't cash it for 3 days. Just kept it in my pocket, afraid that if I tried to deposit it, something would go wrong. That someone would take it away. Really? James looked surprised. But you always seem so together now. That's the thing about recovery, David said. From the outside, it might look smooth. But inside, we're all still fighting battles. The difference is, now we have tools. We have support. We're not fighting alone anymore. They talked for the next hour. David listened as James worked through his fears and anxieties. He didn't try to fix everything or offer easy answers. He just shared his own experience, reminded James of how far he'd come, and helped him make a plan for the week ahead. When James left, he looked lighter somehow. Not fixed, not cured, but a little less burdened, a little more hopeful. David's second appointment was with a new veteran named Kevin, who'd been referred to the foundation by a social worker. Kevin was young, maybe late 20s, and he had that look David recognized immediately. The look of someone barely holding on, someone at the end of their rope. Thanks for seeing me, Kevin said quietly as he sat down. I don't really know why I'm here. My social worker said you might be able to help, but I don't think anyone can help me. David had heard that before, too. He'd said those same words to the colonel 6 months ago. Tell me what's going on, Kevin's story poured out. He'd served 4 years, did a tour overseas, came back and couldn't adjust, lost his job because of panic attacks. His girlfriend left. His family didn't understand why he couldn't just get over it. He'd been living in his car for 2 months, running out of money, running out of hope. It was like looking into a mirror of his own past. David felt the weight of it, the responsibility. This young man was sitting here because he'd heard that someone might understand, might help. David couldn't let him down. Kevin, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me, David said, leaning forward. What you're feeling right now, this hopelessness, this belief that things can't get better, I felt that too. 6 months ago, I was exactly where you are. Living in my car, thinking my life was over, believing I was beyond help. Kevin looked skeptical. You? But you have a job here. You have an office. You look like you've got it together. 6 months ago, I got kicked out of this very bank for trying to cash a check while looking homeless. I was humiliated, broken, ready to give up. David paused, letting that sink in. But someone stood up for me that day. Someone saw me as more than just a homeless guy, and that changed everything. He spent the next hour walking Kevin through what the foundation could do. Housing assistance, job placement, counseling, help navigating the VA system. But more than the practical stuff, David tried to give him something more valuable. Hope. The belief that recovery was possible. I'm not going to lie to you, David said as their session ended. This is going to be hard. There will be days when you want to quit. Days when you think nothing is working. But if you keep showing up, if you let people help you, things can change. I'm living proof of that. Kevin left with a folder full of information and several appointments scheduled for the following week. David wasn't sure if he'd show up to them. Some people did, some people didn't. All he could do was offer the help and hope that Kevin would take it. His third appointment was different. It was with a reporter from the local newspaper. The colonel had arranged it, despite David's protests. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to help people. The reporter, a woman in her 40s named Angela, set up a small recording device on the desk. Thank you for agreeing to talk with me. The colonel told me about what happened here 6 months ago and about the foundation you've built. I think it's a story people need to hear. David felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny. I'm not sure I'm the right person to talk about this. The colonel is the one who did all the real work. But you're the one who lived it, Angela said gently. Your story is the heart of this foundation. People need to hear from someone who's been through it, who's come out the other side. So David told his story. He talked about hitting rock bottom, about being kicked out of the bank, about the colonel standing up for him. He talked about the hard work of recovery, the setbacks, the small victories. He talked about what the foundation was doing and why it mattered. "What do you think people misunderstand most about homeless veterans?" Angela asked. David thought about that for a moment. "I think people assume that if you're homeless, you did something to deserve it. That you're lazy or you made bad choices. They don't understand that sometimes life just breaks you. War breaks you. Trauma breaks you. And when you're broken and alone, it's almost impossible to put yourself back together without help." Over the next hour, they talked about the plans for the foundation. They'd call it second chances because everyone deserved one. They'd help with housing, job placement, counseling, and navigating the VA system. They'd provide immediate assistance, things like food, clothes, hygiene supplies. But more than that, they'd provide hope and dignity and respect. David would work with the colonel, helping veterans one-on-one. He'd use his own story to show them that recovery was possible. That homelessness wasn't the end. That they still mattered. As the meeting wrapped up and people started to leave, David found himself standing in the same spot where he'd been humiliated 3 months ago. But now, instead of shame, he felt purpose. Instead of despair, he felt hope. Instead of being alone, he was part of something bigger than himself. The colonel came to stand beside him. "You doing okay?" David nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he found his voice. "You saved my life that day." "No," the colonel said firmly. "I just reminded people to see you. You saved yourself by not giving up, by taking the help when it was offered, by doing the work. And now you're going to help save others. That's what service is really about." As David walked out of the bank that day, he realized something profound. His darkest moment had led him to his purpose. Being broken had taught him how to help others heal. Losing everything had shown him what truly mattered. He'd gone from being invisible to being seen, from being hopeless to giving hope, from being lost to helping others find their way, and it all started because one person refused to look away. One person decided that dignity mattered. One person stood up and said, "This is not okay. Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world, one person at a time." What would you say to someone who sees a homeless veteran on the street? "See them," David said simply. "Don't look away. Don't judge. Just see them as a human being. And if you can help, help. Even if it's just acknowledging their existence, treating them with basic dignity. That matters more than you know." The interview lasted over an hour. When Angela finally packed up her recording equipment, she looked at David seriously. "Thank you for sharing your story. I think it's going to touch a lot of people." After she left, David sat alone in the office for a while. Through the window, he could see people coming and going in the bank lobby. Regular people doing regular banking. 6 months ago, he'd felt like he didn't belong in that world. Now he realized he'd always belonged. He'd just needed someone to remind him. The colonel knocked on the doorframe and walked in. "How were your appointments today?" "Good," David said. "James is doing better. Kevin, the new guy? I'm not sure yet. We'll see if he comes back." "And the reporter?" David shrugged. "She asked a lot of questions. Made me think about things I don't usually think about." The colonel sat down in the chair across from him. "You know the article is going to bring more attention to the foundation. More veterans who need help. More work." "Good," David said. "That's what we're here for." The colonel smiled. "You've come a long way, David. I'm proud of you." "I had help," David reminded her. "I had you, and now other people have you," she said. "That's how it works. We help each other. We lift each other up. That's what service really means." That evening, David drove home to his small apartment. He stopped at the grocery store on the way, bought food for the week. Regular things. Normal things. Things he'd taken for granted before and now appreciated deeply. As he was leaving the store, he saw a man sitting on the ground near the entrance. Homeless, clearly. People were walking past him, looking away, pretending he didn't exist. David knew that feeling. He stopped and knelt down to the man's level. "Hey, I'm David. You need anything? Food, water?" The man looked up, surprised that someone was actually talking to him like a human being. I could use something to eat." David bought him a meal from the deli counter and a bottle of water. He sat with him for a few minutes, just talking, treating him like a person, giving him what David had needed most when he was in that position: dignity. Before he left, David gave the man a card with the foundation's information. If you're a veteran, come see us. Even if you're not, come see us. We'll try to help. Driving home, David thought about how much his life had changed. How one moment of kindness from a stranger had set everything in motion. How his worst day had somehow led to his purpose. He thought about Kevin and whether he'd show up next week. About James and his ongoing battle. About all the veterans out there who still needed help, who still needed someone to stand up for them. And he thought about how one person really could make a difference. Not by doing something extraordinary, but by simply refusing to look away, by seeing people's humanity, by standing up when others stayed silent. The colonel had done that for him. Now he was doing it for others. And those others would eventually do it for more people. That's how change happened. Not all at once, but one person at a time. One moment of kindness rippling outward, touching more and more lives. Sometimes the biggest impact comes from the smallest actions. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to walk past. One person who says, I see you. You matter. Let me help. That was the real story. Not about banks or confrontations or dramatic moments. About human connection. About dignity. About the simple but profound act of seeing each other and choosing to care.